They often say that forgiveness is the path to peace. But sometimes, for a soul that has been systematically shattered, peace is not found in forgetting. It is found in the slow, meticulous construction of one's own justice, a justice measured with the precision of an architect's blueprint, where every line has a purpose, and every angle is calculated for absolute strength. This was the kind of peace Ethan had spent 5 years building, not with forgiveness, but with concrete, steel, and a silence more profound than any scream. The rain fell in relentless sheets against the panoramic windows of his home, a modern masterpiece of glass and stone nestled in the hills overlooking New York City. Each drop that traced a path down the pane was a ghost of a memory, washing away the man he used to be. 5 years ago, a storm like this would have felt like the sky was weeping with him. Tonight, it was merely weather. Inside, Ethan stood motionless, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the ice clinking softly, the only sound in the cavernous living room. He was no longer the frail, heartbroken man who had lost everything. The architect who had once designed homes for others had finally designed a fortress for himself, and in doing so, had rebuilt the man within it. Then, a sound cut through the rhythm of the storm, sharp and intrusive. The doorbell. Ethan didn't flinch. He set his glass down on a marble countertop with a steady hand and walked over to the security panel on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing a figure huddled on his doorstep, drenched and desperate. It was her, Amelia, his ex-wife, the ghost he had been expecting. She looked nothing like the glamorous woman who had left him, the woman who had laughed as she told him he was too small for her big dreams. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a thin, soaked coat. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by the shivering quiver of desperation. Her face, illuminated by the cold, sterile light of the porch lamp, was a portrait of ruin. Ethan watched her for a long moment. There was no surge of anger, no flicker of pity, not even the phantom ache of lost love. His heart, which had once shattered at the mere thought of her, now beat with the calm, steady rhythm of a metronome. It was the rhythm of a plan reaching its final, inevitable conclusion. He had waited for this moment, not with eagerness, but with the quiet patience of a craftsman waiting for the varnish to dry on his finest work. The work was now complete. Turning away from the screen, he walked towards the grand oak door, his footsteps echoing softly in the hall. The final confrontation had arrived, not with a tempest of emotion, but with the chilling calm that precedes the perfect, quiet execution of a blueprint 5 years in the making. He opened the door. To understand the demolition, you must first appreciate the architecture of the lie. 5 years before that rainy night, Ethan's life was a structure he had designed and built with his own 2 hands, a testament to love, stability, and quiet ambition. He was a rising star in the architectural world, but not the kind that sought the blinding glare of the spotlight. He didn't dream of glass towers that scraped the sky and won cold, prestigious awards. He dreamt of homes. He loved the grain of wood, the honesty of stone, the way light could be coaxed into a room to make it feel like a sanctuary. His work was his art, an extension of his soul, and his greatest masterpiece was the house he shared with Amelia. It was a sprawling mid-century modern home, nestled in a grove of old oak trees in a quiet, affluent suburb. He had spent 2 years designing and overseeing its construction, pouring every ounce of his devotion into its foundation, its clean lines, its seamless integration with the nature around it. The house was Ethan, personified. It was solid, dependable, warm, and built to stand the test of time. It was a home meant for laughter to echo in, for children to run through, for a lifetime of memories to be layered upon its walls like coats of paint. For Ethan, this was the pinnacle of success, a thriving career that he was passionate about, and a beautiful wife to share it all with. Amelia was the vibrant, dazzling centerpiece of his carefully constructed world. When she walked into a room, she was like a splash of brilliant color in a minimalist painting. She was charming, witty, and possessed a beauty so striking it seemed almost unfair. Ethan had loved her since the moment he saw her, loved her with a pure, uncomplicated adoration. He loved the sound of her laughter, the way she would drape herself over his drafting table late at night, the whirlwind of social energy she brought into his calm, ordered life. He saw her as his muse, the life that filled the beautiful spaces he created. He believed their love was the steel frame upon which their entire world was built, unshakable and absolute. He was a man who understood foundations, and he believed theirs was perfect. But Amelia, unlike the house she lived in, was not designed for permanence. She was designed for admiration. While Ethan found joy in the substance of things, Amelia found it in the surface. She loved the idea of being an architect's wife, the prestige it carried in her social circle. She loved hosting dinner parties in their stunning home, showing off the flawless design and the expensive art she had chosen. But the quiet evenings, the comfortable silences, the simple pleasures that Ethan cherished, these things felt to her like a cage. Her spirit craved the ephemeral thrill of the new restaurant, the new designer handbag, the new, exciting acquaintance. Their life, to Ethan, was a finished masterpiece. To Amelia, it was a beautiful but static painting she was growing tired of looking at. This subtle disconnect was amplified by her mother, Eleanor. A woman sculpted from ambition and pragmatism, Eleanor saw her daughter's marriage as a strategic merger. She approved of Ethan's talent, but not his temperament. She saw his contentment not as a virtue, but as a fatal lack of drive. She would visit their perfect home, her eyes scanning everything with a transactional gaze. "The house is divine, Ethan. Truly," she'd say, her voice dripping with insincere sweetness. "But it's a shame your name isn't on one of those new towers downtown. A man of your caliber shouldn't be hiding his light out here in the woods." Her words were seeds of discontent, planted skillfully in the fertile ground of Amelia's boredom. She would take her daughter shopping on Fifth Avenue, swiping a supplementary credit card Ethan dutifully paid off each month, whispering in her ear, "You have a taste for champagne, my dear. Never let a man convince you to settle for water." Ethan, in his trusting nature, saw none of this. He saw a loving mother-in-law and a wife who simply enjoyed the finer things. He worked tirelessly to provide those things, happy to see her happy. He would be hunched over a blueprint, sketching out the bones of a family's new home, and she would be in the next room, scrolling through the Instagram feeds of jet-setting influencers, a quiet envy hardening her features. The gap between their worlds was widening, becoming a silent, invisible canyon in the middle of their open-concept living room. He'd try to bridge it, showing her his latest project with boyish enthusiasm. "Look, Amy, I figured out how to create a cantilevered deck that makes it feel like you're floating over the valley." She would glance up from her phone, offer a distracted, "That's nice, honey," and immediately turn back to the glowing screen, her mind a million miles away in Monaco or Milan. The arguments, when they began, were small fissures in the foundation. They were almost always about money, but not really. Ethan was more than comfortable, but Amelia's spending was becoming astronomical. He'd gently question a credit card statement that read like a luxury goods catalog. "Amy, did we really spend this much on shoes?" And she would turn on him, her voice sharp with indignation. "It's for us, Ethan. It's about maintaining an image. My friends' husbands are partners at their firms, their VPs. We can't look like we're struggling." She was a master at turning his fiscal prudence into a personal failing, making him feel small, cheap, and unambitious for even questioning her. He would inevitably back down, retreating to the quiet solace of his studio, feeling a confusing mix of guilt and unease. He didn't know that she wasn't just maintaining an image, she was auditioning for a new life. The expensive lunches weren't just with her girlfriends. The late nights out weren't just about blowing off steam. They were networking opportunities, scouting missions for an upgrade. She was putting herself on the market while still living in the house he built for her, eating the food he paid for, sleeping in the bed they shared. The perfect facade of their life was her camouflage, allowing her to hunt for something more, something shinier, something she felt she truly deserved. And Ethan, the brilliant architect who could spot a structural flaw from 100 yards away, was blind to the terminal decay happening within his own walls. He still believed in the blueprint. He still believed in the strength of their foundation, even as the woman sleeping next to him was secretly plotting its complete and utter demolition. The first signs of a structural collapse are never dramatic. They are subtle, hairline fractures, tiny shifts that only a trained eye would notice. For Ethan, a man who lived his life believing in solid ground, these first cracks were easy to dismiss as insignificant. They began with her phone. It had become a fifth limb, an extension of her hand that was never far from her grasp. Conversations that once flowed freely would now be conducted in hushed tones in another room. If he walked in unexpectedly, the call would end abruptly with a clipped, "I'll call you back," her eyes darting towards him with a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It looked like annoyance, but it felt like fear. Then came the new vocabulary of her life, filled with sudden obligations he'd never heard of before. There were charity galas that required a weekend retreat for planning, workshops for a new foundation she was supporting, and girls' trips that seemed to be scheduled with increasing, last-minute frequency. She would pack a suitcase full of her most alluring dresses and lingerie for a team-building exercise in the Hamptons, laughing off his raised eyebrow by saying, "You have to look the part, darling." It's all about networking. He wanted to believe her. It was easier to believe that she was simply becoming more socially ambitious than to entertain the cold, slithering alternative that was beginning to coil in the pit of his stomach. He was an architect of stable structures. He refused to believe his own home was built on a fault line. The first tremor, the one that could not be ignored, arrived on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in an innocuous white envelope. Amelia was out for the day, a last-minute spa appointment that she claimed was a gift from a friend. Ethan was sorting through the mail, a mundane chore. He separated the bills from the junk mail, his mind on a difficult trust design for a new project. He saw an envelope from a major credit card company, but the name on the account wasn't his, nor was it their joint card. It was addressed solely to Amelia B. Croft. He assumed it was one of those persistent pre-approved offers and moved to toss it into the recycling bin. But he paused. It felt heavier than junk mail, the paper of a higher quality. A sliver of unease, sharp and unwelcome, pierced his carefully maintained denial. Acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, he slid it open. It wasn't an offer. It was a bill. The first thing that hit him was the balance, a staggering 5-figure number that made his breath catch in his throat. His eyes scanned the list of itemized charges, and the world began to tilt on its axis. Line by line, a secret life unfolded before him, a life lived in parallel to their own. There was a charge for 2 nights in a suite at the Baccarat Hotel, dated the exact weekend she was supposedly at that boring conference in Boston. There was a dinner for 2 at Per Se, a place he had been trying to get reservations at for their anniversary, charged on the night she had worked late with her team. The list went on, a brutal inventory of betrayal, a $2,000 charge at La Perla, a $700 bar tab at a hotel lounge he'd never heard of. And then, the final, devastating blow. A charge from Cartier, dated 3 weeks prior, for an item simply listed as Panthère de Cartier bracelet. He remembered that evening vividly. She had come home late, flushed and excited, claiming her charity committee had surprised her with a spa gift certificate to celebrate a successful fundraiser. He had been so proud of her. He sat at the kitchen island, the statement spread out before him, the architecture of his marriage collapsing in his mind. Each charge was a wrecking ball, demolishing a memory, turning something beautiful into rubble. His love for her, the trust he had given so freely, felt foolish, naive. He wasn't angry yet. The shock was too profound, a cold numbness that seeped into his bones. He waited. He sat in the silence of their perfect house for hours, the damning piece of paper lying in a pool of late afternoon sunlight, waiting for his wife to come home. When Amelia walked in, humming a cheerful tune and carrying a bag from Bergdorf's, the sight of him sitting there, his face pale and grave, made her stop short. Her smile faltered. "Ethan, is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He didn't say a word. He simply pushed the statement across the smooth marble island towards her. She glanced down, and for a fraction of a second, he saw it. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed in her eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. The performance began. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "It came in the mail today," he said, his own voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was junk. I opened it by mistake." She snatched the paper up, her eyes scanning it, not with the guilt of being caught, but with the outrage of being discovered. She didn't try to explain the charges, she attacked him instead. "You opened my mail? My private mail? What in the world gives you the right to do that, Ethan?" "Amelia, the hotel, the dinners, the bracelet. Just explain it to me." "Explain it?" she scoffed, her laugh sharp and humorless. "What I should be explaining is why my husband feels the need to spy on me. This is what you think of me? That I'm some liar? After all these years, you have so little faith in me that you resort to this?" She was a master of misdirection, turning his pain into a weapon against him. She made his discovery the crime, and her betrayal the justifiable reaction to his suffocating lack of trust. When he stood his ground, his voice finally gaining a sliver of strength, demanding an answer, she played her trump card. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, and put it on speaker. "Mother, you will not believe what Ethan is doing." Eleanor's voice, sharp and laced with venom, filled the kitchen. "What has he done now?" "He's accusing me of awful things. He went through my private mail, Mother. He has this credit card statement, and he's making up these insane stories." Ethan listened, stunned into silence, as Eleanor's voice dripped poison into his ear. "Oh, Amelia, I am so sorry. I warned you he had an insecure streak. A man who is content with so little is always threatened by a woman who wants the world. Don't you let him bully you, darling. He's the one with the problem, not you. A marriage without trust is a prison." Amelia hung up, a look of vindicated triumph on her face. "You see? Even my mother can see how crazy this island. You've created this entire fantasy because you can't stand to see me happy and independent." She grabbed the statement, tore it into pieces, and threw them into the trash. "We can talk about this when you're ready to apologize for violating my privacy and for this disgusting lack of faith." With that, she turned and walked up the floating staircase he had so proudly designed, the sound of her bedroom door slamming shut like a gunshot in the silent, broken house. He was left alone in the wreckage, the torn pieces of evidence in the bin, and the poisonous words of two women echoing in his ears, making him question everything, even the undeniable truth right in front of him. The first crack had become a gaping chasm, and he felt himself falling. The apology he was told to give never came. In the days that followed their fight, a chilling silence settled over the house, thicker and more suffocating than any argument. Amelia moved through the rooms like a ghost, her face a mask of polite indifference. She was playing the part of the wronged wife, waiting for her husband to beg for forgiveness for his imaginary crime of mistrust. But her performance was wasted. Ethan was no longer watching her. He was watching the man in the mirror, a man he barely recognized. The gaslighting had been a brutal success, leaving him disoriented and questioning his own judgment. Yet, beneath the confusion, the cold, hard facts of the credit card statement remained, like shards of glass embedded in his mind. He knew he wasn't crazy. An architect deals in absolutes, in the unyielding laws of physics and mathematics. A foundation is either sound or it is not. A beam can either bear the load or it will fail. And a story is either true or it is a lie. His wife's story was a lie. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, grim certainty. The pain of her potential betrayal was terrifying, but the agony of living in this fog of deceit, of sleeping next to a woman who was a stranger, was worse. He needed the truth, in all its brutal, unvarnished ugliness. He needed a foundation to stand on, even if it was the foundation of a ruin. 1 week after Amelia tore up the evidence of her secret life, Ethan sat in a sterile, anonymous office downtown, across from a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a private investigator, a former detective with tired eyes that had seen every flavor of human treachery. Ethan, a man who built beautiful, transparent spaces, was now paying a stranger to peer into the dark, hidden corners of his own life. He handed over a photograph of Amelia, a picture from their last vacation, her smile radiant and utterly false. "I need to know everything," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "Where she goes, who she sees. I need facts." The facts began to arrive 2 days later, delivered in a sterile, encrypted email. The first attachment was a photograph. Amelia, seated at a sun-drenched cafe patio, the kind of place she always claimed was too cliché. She was laughing, her head tilted back in a way he hadn't seen in years. Across from her sat a man. He was handsome in a slick, polished way, with an expensive watch on his wrist and a smile that was all teeth. He was leaning forward, his hand resting casually on Amelia's arm. They looked comfortable, intimate. The file name was Julian_Vance.jpg. The email contained a brief bio. Julian Vance, a high-yield equities trader known for a flashy lifestyle and a portfolio of high-risk, high-reward investments. The updates continued daily, each one a precise, clinical incision into Ethan's dying marriage. A photo of Amelia and Julian leaving a luxury condo building downtown, the same building she claimed a girlfriend had just moved into. A GPS tracker report from her car showing it parked overnight at that condo, not once, but 3 times in a single week. A copy of a dinner receipt from a restaurant, paid for by Vance, on an evening Amelia was supposedly at a late-night yoga class. Marcus Thorne presented the information without commentary, but Ethan could read the pity in his professional detachment. He was just another client, another broken man paying to have his heart surgically removed. The final report was not delivered by email. Thorne requested a meeting. In the same sterile office, he slid a thin manila folder across the desk. "There's something else, Ethan. It's not just an affair, it's financial." Inside the folder were copies of bank statements from their joint savings account, the account that held the down payment for this house, the seed money for his firm, the nest egg he had painstakingly built for their future. He saw a series of large, systematic withdrawals, each one just under the $10,000 federal reporting limit. 24 withdrawals over 6 months, totaling nearly $200,000. At the bottom of the pile was a copy of a cashier's check made out to a holding company. The PI had traced the company back to its sole proprietor, Julian Vance. Every withdrawal slip, every transfer authorization, bore one clear signature: Amelia's. This was the ultimate shock. This was not a crime of passion. This was a conspiracy. This was theft. The affair was a betrayal of his heart, but this was a betrayal of their entire life, of their shared past and their planned future. She wasn't just cheating on him, she was liquidating him. That night, Ethan went home and prepared the scene. He took the folder from Thorne and laid out its contents on their long, polished mahogany dining table. He arranged the photographs of Amelia and Julian in a neat timeline. Next to them, he placed the hotel folios, the restaurant receipts, the GPS logs. And at the very end of the table, he placed the bank statements and the withdrawal slips, fanned out like a losing hand of cards. He stood back, looking at the display. It was the blueprint of his own destruction. When Amelia came home, she found him standing there in the dim light, waiting. "Ethan, you're scaring me," she began, her voice laced with false concern. "There's no need to be scared, Amelia," he said. His voice was unnervingly calm, devoid of the pain and confusion she had heard before. It was the voice of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "And there's no need to lie anymore. The show is over." He gestured to the table. She walked over, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. As her eyes took in the curated exhibit of her deceit, every drop of color drained from her face. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The panicked woman, the furious victim, the wounded wife, all of those characters vanished. In their place stood a stranger, her eyes cold and hard as granite. She looked at the evidence, then looked at him, and a small, cruel smile played on her lips. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with a cynicism he had never heard. "I have to admit, this is more thorough than I would have expected. The quiet architect has a little fight in him after all." There was no apology, no remorse, only a chilling, brazen honesty. "Why?" It was the only word he could manage to speak. "Why?" she laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Ethan, you build such beautiful, strong, boring houses. And you built me a beautiful, strong, boring life. Did you really think this was enough for me? Quiet weekends in the suburbs? Your tedious dinner parties with your boring clients? I want to live, Ethan. I want excitement. I want to feel the world rush past me, not watch it from a perfectly framed window. She picked up a photo of herself and Julian, tapping the image with a manicured fingernail. Julian gets that. He isn't afraid to risk everything for a bigger prize. You're afraid to even ask for a bigger project. You're a wonderful craftsman, my dear. But you are a terrible gambler. And life, real life, is a gamble. Ender 10. She walked around the table, her words a deliberate, systematic demolition of his self-worth. The truth is, I was suffocating here with you. Your quiet devotion felt like a chain. Your steadiness felt like a cage. I don't want a man who builds me a sanctuary. I want a man who builds me an empire, or at least buys me a ticket to see one. She stopped in front of him, her eyes merciless. So, yes, I took the money. Consider it severance pay for the years I spent playing the part of the happy, contented wife in your little suburban play. It was a role I was never meant for. She turned and walked towards the front door. My bags are in the car. Julian is waiting. We have a flight to catch. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, turning back to deliver the final, killing blow. Don't look so sad, Ethan. You should thank me. I've just given you the one thing you never had the courage to build for yourself, a life that is entirely your own. And with that, she was gone. The door clicked shut, and an absolute silence descended upon the house. He was left standing alone, surrounded by the irrefutable, black and white proof of a life that had been a complete and utter lie. The truth had finally been revealed, not as a cleansing fire, but as a silent, crushing avalanche, burying him alive in the ruins. The first week was a blur of silence and ghosts. After Amelia left, the house, his greatest creation, transformed into his tomb. Every room held an echo of her laughter, every surface held the ghost of her touch. He'd find a single, long blonde hair on a pillow, and the sight would cripple him for hours. The perfect, open-concept design that was meant for a life of shared joy now felt like a vast, empty stage where he was the sole audience to a tragedy. He stopped answering his phone. He stopped checking his email. The world outside the floor-to-ceiling windows ceased to exist. He existed only in the wreckage, breathing in the dust of his demolished life. But the world, with its relentless demands, does not pause for heartbreak. The first official notice arrived a month later, a cold, formal letter from the bank regarding a missed mortgage payment. He stared at it, the words blurring. The mortgage, like everything else, had been tied to their joint accounts, the very accounts Amelia had systematically plundered. A quick, frantic check of his finances confirmed the terrifying reality. She hadn't just taken their savings, she had taken their liquidity, the lifeblood of their existence. After paying his firm's small staff and covering immediate business expenses, there was almost nothing left. He was house rich and cash poor, the king of a castle he could no longer afford to keep. Selling the house was the most surreal and painful experience of his life. It was a public auction of his failure. He had to watch strangers walk through his sanctuary, commenting on the woodwork he had hand-selected, judging the flow of the space he had dreamt up on sleepless nights. The real estate agent, a woman with a plastic smile and pitying eyes, spoke of its excellent resale value, as if she were discussing a commodity, and not the vessel of his entire soul. The house sold quickly, to a young tech executive and his beaming, pregnant wife. On the final day, Ethan walked through the empty rooms one last time, his footsteps echoing with a deafening finality. He handed the keys to the new owner, a man his own age, with a future bright, with the same promise Ethan once held. "You built something beautiful here," the man said, shaking his hand with genuine admiration. Ethan could only nod, the words turning to ash in his mouth before they could be spoken. He walked away from the house without looking back, feeling like he had just sold his own skeleton. His work became the next casualty. The passion that had once fueled him was gone, replaced by a profound apathy. He'd sit at his drafting table in the small, soulless office he could now barely afford, and stare at blank sheets of paper for hours. The elegant lines and bold concepts that once came so easily were now locked away behind a wall of grief and humiliation. Clients would call, their initial patience fraying into frustration, then anger. "Ethan, where are the final schematics? We were supposed to break ground last week." A voice would bark from the speakerphone. Ethan would look at the phone, feeling nothing, and let it go to voicemail. He lost 2 major contracts in the span of a month. His lead draftsman, a talented young man he had mentored, quit, giving him a look that was a painful mixture of sympathy and disappointment. Phoenix Architecture, the firm he had named for its ability to rise, was crashing and burning. He moved into a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment in a part of the city he used to drive through with his windows rolled up. The beautiful, custom-made furniture from his old life was either sold for pennies on the dollar or crammed awkwardly into the small space, a constant, mocking reminder of what he'd lost. He lived out of boxes, unable to muster the will to unpack. His diet consisted of whiskey and whatever takeout he could order without having to speak to another human being. He stopped shaving. He stopped caring. He was adrift in a sea of despair, and he was letting himself sink. It was during this bleak period that the final, most vicious blow was struck. He was sitting in the dark, staring at the wall, when his phone, which had been silent for weeks, buzzed with an unknown number. He ignored it, but it buzzed again, persistent. Annoyed, he answered, his voice a hoarse croak. "Hello? Ethan? It's Eleanor." The voice was unmistakable, sharp and cold as ice. He was too stunned to hang up. "What do you want, Eleanor?" "Oh, I'm not calling for me, dear. I just thought you should know. I'm with Amelia. We're in Monaco, on a friend's yacht. The weather is just divine." There was a triumphant, gloating quality to her tone. "She is just radiant. I've never seen her so happy. She's wearing a beautiful Cartier bracelet, a gift from Julian. She looks like she belongs here." Each word was a carefully aimed dart. He remained silent, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. She continued, savoring his silence. "She told me about how you had to sell the house. It's a pity, but between us, that little house was always beneath her. You were always beneath her. You tried to keep her in a cage, Ethan, a pretty, well-designed cage, but a cage nonetheless. She's a creature of the world, and you just wanted to keep her in your little suburban terrarium. I'm glad she finally found the courage to leave a man who couldn't give her the life she deserved." "Is that all?" he managed to choke out. "Yes," she purred. "I just wanted to call and offer my condolences for your loss. Though really, it was always her loss, wasn't it? Being stuck with you for so long." The line went dead. Ethan dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, but he didn't notice. Eleanor's words had found the last vestiges of his self-worth and systematically annihilated them. He was a failure, a cage builder, an anchor. Amelia's parting words had been cruel, but her mother's were poison, designed to seep into his soul and rot him from the inside out. He stumbled to the kitchen, poured a glass to the brim with whiskey, and drank it down in one searing gulp. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, a gaunt, haunted stranger with hollow eyes. He was at the bottom of the abyss. He had lost his wife, his home, his career, and now, thanks to Eleanor, his last shred of dignity. There was nothing left of the old Ethan. He was a ruin, and as he slid down the wall to the floor, the empty glass falling from his hand, he felt the darkness finally, completely, swallow him whole. The abyss is not a bottomless pit. It is a place of crushing pressure and absolute darkness, and for a time, Ethan surrendered to its weight. He let the days and nights bleed into one another, marked only by the emptying and refilling of a whiskey bottle. He was a ghost haunting the cramped apartment, a vessel filled with nothing but the echoes of Eleanor's venom and Amelia's cruel, parting laughter. He had accepted his ruin. He had agreed with their verdict. He was a failure, a small man, a footnote in the grand, exciting story of their lives. The catalyst for his ascent was not a single dramatic event, but a quiet, humiliating one. An eviction notice, a stark white paper taped to his door, its official language a cold slap in the face. He had ignored the warning letters, just as he had ignored everything else. Now, the consequences were unavoidable. He was about to be homeless. That night, something in him shifted. He stumbled into the grimy bathroom and caught his reflection under the flickering fluorescent light. He saw a gaunt stranger with a matted beard and hollow, dead eyes. This was not Ethan Hayes, the the promising architect. This was a man who had been hollowed out and left for dead. This was the man they had made. And in that moment, the grief that had drowned him for months began to recede, and in its place, something else began to boil. It was a cold, quiet rage. It was the fury of a man who had finally, truly, seen the face of his enemy in his own reflection and decided he would not let them win. The sorrow had been a paralyzing fog. The anger was a lens, bringing the world into sharp, unforgiving focus. It was not a hot, reckless anger, but a deep, glacial fury. It was the anger of a builder who looks upon a demolished masterpiece and doesn't mourn, but instead begins to calculate, with cold precision, the force required to build something so immense, so powerful, that the memory of the old structure would be completely and utterly obliterated. His pain was not gone, but he had found a way to repurpose it. He would use it as fuel. He would use every lie, every insult, every stolen dollar as a brick in the foundation of his new life. The next morning, Ethan did something he hadn't done in months. He made a plan. He knew he couldn't fight this battle with architectural drawings alone. This was a different kind of war, fought on a battlefield of contracts, loopholes, and financial leverage. He needed a different kind of weapon. He spent 3 days in the local library, not looking at design books, but poring over legal journals and business directories. He wasn't looking for a divorce lawyer to help him cry on his shoulder. He was looking for a killer. He found him in the form of Arthur Davies, a legendary corporate litigator on the verge of retirement, a man known for his brilliant, merciless mind and for taking on only the most complex cases. Davies' office was a world away from the slick, glass, and chrome aesthetic of Julian Vance's world. It was old, paneled in dark wood, smelling of leather and aged paper. Davies himself was a man in his late 70s, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 broken contracts and shattered partnerships. He listened to Ethan's story, his face impassive, showing no flicker of sympathy. He had heard 100 stories like it. But then Ethan's tone changed. He stopped talking about his broken heart and started talking about the money. He laid out the PI's reports, the bank statements, the timeline of the fraud. He presented his case not with the quavering voice of a victim, but with the cold, factual precision of an architect, explaining a structural failure. "I'm not here to sue her for infidelity, Mr. Davies," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm not interested in alimony or emotional damages. She stole nearly $200,000 through a series of structured withdrawals to avoid federal reporting, funneling it to her lover's holding company. That is wire fraud. That is a conspiracy. I am here to understand the legal architecture of my response." Davies leaned forward, a flicker of genuine interest in his tired eyes. He had expected a broken man. He was looking at a man holding a blueprint. He studied Ethan for a long moment, then leaned back in his leather chair. "You could sue," Davies said, his voice a low rumble. "We could spend 2 years in litigation. You might win. You'd get some of the money back, minus my substantial fees. She would declare bankruptcy. You would have your pound of flesh, and you would still be a broken man living in a cheap apartment, defined by the woman who wronged you." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But you didn't come here for that, did you, Mr. Hayes? You came here for advice. So here at Island." He steepled his fingers, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Forget the money she stole. In the grand scheme of things, it is a pittance. Do not try to reclaim what was lost. It's gone. Instead, you must build something so immense, so successful, so magnificent, that $200,000 becomes nothing more than a rounding error. The greatest revenge is not a courtroom victory. It is making your enemies irrelevant. It is building a life so far beyond their reach that their existence is a mere speck in your rearview mirror." He smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "And Mr. Hayes, make damn sure every single brick you lay is meticulously, unimpeachably legal." How? Ethan walked out of that office, a different man. The weight of his grief had been lifted, replaced by the heavy, satisfying burden of purpose. Mr. Saladivar. Davies hadn't given him a legal strategy, he had given him a design philosophy. He went back to his apartment, but he no longer saw the squalor. He saw a blank canvas. That evening, he methodically cleaned the entire apartment, throwing out the empty bottles and takeout containers. He shaved off the beard, scrubbing away the face of the victim. He then cleared his small dining table, unrolled a sheet of pristine white drafting paper, and picked up a charcoal pencil. He didn't sketch a house, he sketched a flowchart, a business plan, a 5-year strategy. He would use the pittance he had left from the sale of his house not to survive, but to invest. He would start a new firm, from scratch. It would not be the small boutique company he had before. It would be lean, aggressive, and innovative. He would focus on the one area he had always been passionate about, but had deemed too risky before: revolutionary, sustainable, green architecture. It was a gamble, a field the established firms were too slow to dominate. It was the kind of risk Julian Vance would understand. But Ethan would approach it not with a gambler's recklessness, but with an architect's precision. At the bottom of the page, he wrote down the company's mission statement, and below that, its name. He looked at the words, the first brick in his new empire, the cornerstone of his revenge. It would not be a monument to his pain, but a testament to his survival. He would not tear them down. He would simply build his world so high that he would never have to see them again. The name he wrote was a promise to himself. It was Phoenix Architecture. The ashes of Ethan's old life became the forge for the new one. He didn't just start a new company, he launched a crusade. The first year of Phoenix Architecture was a brutal, relentless grind. He operated out of a small, rented office space above a laundromat, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee, ozone from the overworked printers, and the sheer, raw energy of obsessive work. He hired 2 of the brightest graduates he could find, young, hungry architects who were disillusioned with the corporate grind of the big firms and captivated by Ethan's radical vision. He couldn't offer them high salaries or fancy perks. He offered them a mission: to stop building monuments to ego and start building a sustainable future. Sleep became a luxury he rarely afforded himself. He'd often wake up slumped over his drafting table, a compass still clutched in his hand. His fuel was no longer pain, but purpose. The memory of Amelia and Julian, living lavishly on his stolen future, was a whetstone against which he sharpened his ambition. Every late night, every skipped meal, every sacrifice was a silent act of defiance. He channeled all the passion he once poured into his marriage, into his work, and the result was something fierce and brilliant. His designs were bold, innovative, and unapologetically idealistic. He designed buildings with green roofs that produced food, facades with algae panels that generated biofuel, and water recycling systems that could slash a building's consumption by 90%. His work wasn't just about being eco-friendly, it was a complete reimagining of the relationship between a structure and its environment. While Ethan was building ecosystems, Amelia and Julian were consuming worlds. He would occasionally see glimpses of their life, a digital haunting he couldn't entirely escape. A friend, with hesitant pity, might mention an article in a vanity magazine. Or, in a moment of weakness, he would type a name into a search bar. He saw them at the Cannes Film Festival, dripping with jewels. He saw them on a private ski slope in Gstaad, wrapped in fur. He saw an Instagram post from Amelia, posing on the deck of a yacht in Santorini, the water a brilliant blue behind her. The caption read, "Living the life I was designed for. Number no regrets. Number upgrade." For the old Ethan, each image would have been a dagger to the heart. For the new Ethan, it was simply data. It was evidence of a lifestyle built on combustion, burning through cash with an unsustainable ferocity. He knew with an architect's certainty that any structure with a faulty, consumptive core was destined for collapse. He, on the other hand, was building things to last. His breakthrough came 18 months in, from a project no other established firm would touch. It was an international competition to design a public library and learning center for a blighted, post-industrial neighborhood in Detroit. The budget was razor thin, and the prestige was non-existent. But Ethan saw an opportunity. He poured everything into the proposal. His design wasn't just a building, it was a self-sustaining organism. It featured a solar glass roof that powered the entire structure, a geothermal heating system, and an indoor vertical farm that would supply fresh produce to the community. It was radical, brilliant, and wildly ambitious. Phoenix Architecture was a tiny, unknown firm competing against global titans. No one thought they had a chance. 6 months later, he was standing on a stage in Stockholm, accepting the prestigious Pritzker Prize for Architecture, the industry's equivalent of a Nobel. The win sent shockwaves through the architectural world. Suddenly, Ethan Hayes, the quiet architect who had vanished, was the most talked-about name in the business. In his acceptance speech, he didn't thank his mentors or talk about his journey. He spoke with cold, clear passion about the moral imperative to build responsibly, to create structures that give more than they take. The speech was a quiet manifesto, and the world of money and power took notice. The day after he returned from Stockholm, he received a call from Arthur Davies. "I trust you had a pleasant trip, Mr. Hayes," the old lawyer rumbled. "It seems your work is garnering some attention. I have some people who would like to meet you. They are not interested in pretty buildings. They are interested in the future." The meeting took place in a private equity firm's boardroom, a place of hushed power and old money. Ethan, in a simple, well-tailored dark suit, stood before a dozen stone-faced investors. He didn't give them a sales pitch, he gave them a lecture. He laid out, with an unnerving calm and absolute authority, the inevitable future of urban development. He showed them the data on climate change, resource scarcity, and energy costs. He proved, with numbers and logic, that his model of sustainable architecture was not an environmentalist's fantasy, but the only financially viable path forward. The future of real estate, he concluded, is not in building bigger, it is in building smarter, and my company is 5 years ahead of everyone else on the planet. They funded him, not with a small seed round, but with a massive 9-figure investment that made Phoenix Architecture a major player overnight. The growth was explosive. Within 2 years, the firm moved from the office above the laundromat to 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper, one that Ethan had, ironically, helped design years ago at his old firm. His staff grew from 2 to 200. Phoenix Architecture wasn't just designing libraries anymore. They were designing corporate headquarters, university campuses, and entire self-sustaining residential communities. Ethan Hayes became a brand, a synonym for cutting-edge, intelligent design. He was featured in Forbes, in the Wall Street Journal. He was the quiet, intense genius who was changing the face of cities. 3 years to the day after Amelia had walked out his door, Ethan stood in his corner office, looking out at the New York City skyline. It was a view that commanded respect, a view he had earned. He was no longer the man she had left. The gentle softness in his eyes had been replaced by a focused, analytical calm. He was lean, fit, and dressed in the quiet, bespoke elegance of a man comfortable with power. His phone buzzed. It was a notification from a news app, an algorithm-driven article it thought he'd find interesting. Titans of Finance Vacation in Street Barts. The thumbnail image showed a group of people on a beach. In the center was Julian Vance, looking tanned but noticeably older, a strained look around his eyes. And beside him, holding a champagne glass, was Amelia. Her smile was bright, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a hardness there, a brittle quality he had never seen before. Ethan looked at the picture of the woman who had shattered his world. He searched within himself for the familiar ache of betrayal, for the hot sting of anger. For anything, he found nothing. It was like looking at a photograph of a stranger from a lifetime ago. Her choices, her life, her world, they had become completely and utterly irrelevant. He swiped the notification away, dismissing it without a second thought, and turned back to the blueprints spread across his desk. They showed the designs for a revolutionary new headquarters for a global tech company, his most ambitious project yet. He picked up his pencil. He had an empire to build. While Phoenix Architecture was laying foundations of stone and steel, the paradise Amelia and Julian had built for themselves was proving to be little more than a magnificent castle of sand, built just below the high tide line. For 3 years, They had lived a life of pure, unadulterated hedonism, a whirlwind of manufactured glamour played out against the sun-drenched backdrop of the French Riviera. Their home was a sprawling penthouse apartment in Monaco, with a terrace that overlooked the harbor, a daily tableau of mega yachts and shimmering blue water. Their days were a blur of champagne lunches, designer shopping sprees, high-stakes poker games at the casino, and being seen at all the right parties, their faces appearing regularly in the glossy pages of society magazines. Amelia had fully embraced the role she believed she was born to play. She was no longer just a beautiful woman. She was a fixture, an accessory to the enigmatic and successful Julian Vance. She curated their life for public consumption, every Instagram post a carefully crafted vignette of effortless luxury. She believed in the fantasy with every fiber of her being because the alternative was unthinkable. She had traded a life of substance for a life of spectacle, and for a time, the spectacle was blindingly beautiful. Julian, for his part, played the role of the maverick financier to perfection. He was always armed with a hot stock tip, a story of a recent windfall, and an aura of supreme, unshakable confidence. He moved through the world of the ultra-rich, not like a guest, but like he owned the place. But a lifestyle fueled by consumption requires a constant, massive infusion of capital. The initial $200,000 from Ethan's life savings, which had seemed like an infinite treasure to Amelia, had been the seed money, the buy-in. It had been incinerated within the first year on the apartment's deposit, a leased Ferrari, and a wardrobe of haute couture. Since then, they had been living entirely on Julian's genius, a high-wire act of leveraging one risky investment against another. He wasn't an investor, he was a gambler, and the market had been on a winning streak. But as any gambler knows, the house always wins eventually. The first crack in their perfect, sun-drenched paradise was small, almost unnoticeable. It was a declined credit card. Amelia was in a Chanel boutique in Monte Carlo, about to purchase a handbag she felt she simply couldn't live without. The sales assistant, a woman who usually fawned over her, swiped the black card once, twice, then offered a tight, professional smile. "I'm so sorry, Madam Vance. There seems to be an issue. Do you have another form of payment?" The flush of humiliation was hot and immediate. Amelia, flustered, made a joke about her terrible husband, probably freezing the account as a prank, and paid with a different card, but the incident left a sour taste in her mouth. That night, she brought it up with Julian. He was on the terrace, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the harbor lights. When she mentioned the declined card, his usual smooth, reassuring demeanor vanished. He became defensive, sharp. "It's a technical glitch, Amelia. A security flag. Don't worry your pretty little head about it," he snapped, his voice harsher than she'd ever heard it. "But Julian," it was embarrassing, she pressed. "And last week, the concierge mentioned our building fees are overdue. Is everything all right?" He turned to face her, his eyes cold in the moonlight. "Everything is all right, because I make it all right. I handle the complexities. Your job is to be beautiful, to be charming, to be the reason people want to be at our parties. Let me worry about the money." It was the first time he had ever spoken down to her, the first time she felt less like a partner and more like a high-end employee. The conversation was over, but a seed of anxiety had been planted. The seed was watered by a sudden, vicious downturn in the global tech market. Julian had bet heavily and foolishly on a portfolio of volatile startups, convinced he could ride the bubble to an even greater fortune. He had been leveraged to the hilt. When the bubble burst, he wasn't just losing profits, he was facing catastrophic losses that wiped out nearly everything. He tried to hide it, spending more time locked in his home office, his voice on the phone no longer confident and booming, but tense and pleading. The invitations to parties began to dry up. The word was out on the gilded streets of Monaco. Julian Vance had lost his Midas touch. The fantasy unraveled with terrifying speed. The first real casualty was the Ferrari. It was quietly repossessed one morning before the sun came up. Julian claimed it was in the shop for a major upgrade. Then came the calls from creditors, polite at first, then increasingly demanding. The carefree laughter that once filled their penthouse was replaced by the tense silence of two people pretending everything was fine, while knowing they were standing on a trapdoor. The breaking point came at the annual Red Cross Ball, the crown jewel of the Monaco social season. It was the one event they couldn't afford to miss, a last-ditch attempt to project an image of stability. Amelia wore a dazzling gown from a previous season, praying no one would notice, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. People who once rushed to greet them now offered only cool nods. She overheard two women whispering behind their fans, "To lost a fortune. They say he's completely wiped out." The humiliation was a physical pain, a sharp stabbing in her chest. On the car ride home, the dam of their denial finally broke. "They were talking about you, about us," Amelia hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "They were pitying me. You said everything was fine." "Everything is fine," Julian roared back, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's a temporary setback. The market will rebound." "A setback?" "Julian, my card was declined buying a purse. We're being shunned. You're a fraud. You promised me a world of success, not this public disgrace." His composure finally shattered, and the slick, charming man she thought she knew was replaced by a cornered, vicious animal. "A fraud? You knew exactly what you were getting into." He spat, his face contorted with fury. "Don't you dare play the victim. You're the one who wanted all of this. The clothes, the parties, the pathetic need to be admired. You're just a greedy, shallow gold digger who hitched her wagon to the wrong star. You think I don't know why you left your boring little architect husband? You saw a bigger paycheck." The ugly truth of their relationship, an unspoken contract of mutual use, was finally laid bare in the confines of the luxury car. They weren't partners in love. They were co-conspirators in a heist that had failed. They arrived back at the penthouse, not speaking, the air thick with the poison of their words. The beautiful apartment, with its stunning view, now felt like a gilded cage. The party was over. The dark clouds that had been gathering on the horizon had finally rolled in, and the paradise they had built on a foundation of lies and stolen money was about to be washed away by a storm of their own making. The aftermath of their explosive fight was not a war, but a cold, suffocating ceasefire. Julian and Amelia moved through the opulent penthouse like ghosts, the unspoken truths of their relationship hovering in the air between them. The eviction notice sat on the marble countertop, a stark white tombstone for their life of fantasy. The calls from creditors became a constant, shrill chorus. Their paradise had become a prison, and they were both searching for an escape route. Amelia, steeped in denial, hoped Julian would pull one last rabbit out of his hat. Julian, ever the pragmatist, was simply looking for a life raft big enough for one. One evening, he approached her, the old, dazzling smile back in place, though it didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. "I've done it, baby," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial purr. "I've secured a new line of funding, a sheikh in Dubai. He's a bit old-fashioned, wants to meet in person to sign the papers. This is it. This is the comeback." Amelia felt a surge of dizzying relief. She had been right to trust him. "We'll be bigger than ever," he continued, taking her hands in his. "But we need to be smart. We need to liquidate our remaining assets here, everything portable. It's better to arrive in Dubai with a clean slate and operating capital. Your jewelry, the watches, we need it all to make a good impression." Desperate to believe in the fantasy again, she agreed without hesitation. She helped him gather her collection of jewels, the diamond earrings, the sapphire necklace, and the Panthère de Cartier bracelet, the very symbol of his supposed affection and success. She packed it all into a velvet pouch and handed it to him, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. That night, for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, dreaming of penthouses overlooking the Arabian Gulf. She woke to silence. The space next to her in the bed was cold. A sliver of morning light cut across the room, illuminating an envelope propped against her pillow. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She ripped it open. It wasn't a love letter. It was a death sentence. The note was written on the hotel's stationery in Julian's elegant, flowing script. "My dearest Amelia," it began. "I'm sorry it had to end this way, but business is business. The deal in Dubai is very real, but it was never a we proposition. It's a solo act. You've become, To put it in financial terms, a non-performing asset. Your maintenance costs far exceed your returns. Every word was a meticulously crafted cruelty. Think of this as a final, valuable lesson in portfolio management. Always cut your losses. The jewelry will make a much better impression without you attached to it. The bracelet, by the way, was never truly yours to begin with. Consider it a long-term lease that has just expired. Don't try to find me. The mountain of debt we accrued in Monaco is, I'm afraid, legally tied to the residency papers that are solely in your name. A slight oversight on your part. Tisk. There's enough cash in the envelope for a one-way ticket somewhere less expensive. Good luck, Jay. The world tilted and went gray. The man she had left her husband for, the man for whom she had burned her entire life to the ground, was not just a gambler. He was a con artist of the highest order. And she had been his final, most profitable mark. The betrayal was so absolute, so mirroring of her own actions toward Ethan, that she couldn't even process the irony. There was only the cold, gut-wrenching shock of being utterly and completely destroyed. Her day descended further into hell. As if on cue, two stern-faced men from the building management, accompanied by a bailiff, arrived to execute the eviction order. Her protests were met with stony indifference. She was escorted out of the building she had once lorded over, allowed to take only one suitcase, the doorman who used to bow to her now refusing to meet her eyes. She stood on the sun-drenched curb of Monte Carlo, a pariah in Chanel, with a one-way ticket to oblivion in her purse. She flew back to New York in a cramped middle seat in economy class, a 9-hour journey of shame and simmering rage. She was surrounded by tourists and families, anonymous and invisible, stripped of the glamorous identity she had so carefully constructed. When she landed, she was too proud, too humiliated to call her mother. Admitting the full, catastrophic scale of her failure to Eleanor was a fate worse than death. Instead, she took a taxi to a bleak, hourly-rate motel near JFK, a place that smelled of disinfectant and despair. The next few weeks were a brutal education in survival. Her remaining designer clothes and handbags were sold one by one to a series of condescending consignment shop owners, each transaction a small death, stripping away the last vestiges of her former self. The cash she received was barely enough to live on. Soon, it was gone, and the horrifying reality set in. She needed a job. After a dozen rejections, she was hired as a waitress at a bustling, mid-tier diner in Queens. Her uniform was a polyester dress that chafed her skin. Her shoes were a brand she'd never heard of, and her hands, once perfectly manicured, were soon raw from carrying hot plates and scrubbing tables. The woman who once sent back a bottle of wine, because it was 1 degree too warm now, had to smile placidly as customers yelled at her for bringing them the wrong kind of toast. She was no longer served, she served. The humiliation was a constant burning fire in her gut. One rainy Tuesday night, at the end of an exhausting 10-hour shift, she was cleaning a table when a group of businessmen left. One of them had, as a joke, left her a single penny for a tip. It was the final, petty indignity. She stared at the useless copper coin, and something inside her finally snapped. The self-pity, the shock, the grief, it all burned away, calcifying into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear. Resentment. She looked at her reflection in the rain-streaked window, a tired, defeated woman in a cheap uniform. This was not her. This was a temporary inconvenience, an injustice that had to be rectified. The world had wronged her. Julian had wronged her. And as she stood there, the penny still on the table, her mind turned to the origin of it all. It turned to Ethan. She remembered his kindness, his devotion, his quiet strength. But she didn't remember them with fondness or regret. She remembered them as weaknesses, as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He was stable. He was successful, she had seen the articles, of course, with a bitter, jealous pang. He was her only way out. He had loved her once, foolishly and completely. A love like that, she reasoned, doesn't just die. It could be rekindled. It could be manipulated. The collapse of her sandcastle was complete, and in its desolate ruins, Amelia, the ultimate survivor, began to draft the blueprint for her final, most audacious con, the reclamation of Ethan Hayes. The penny on the diner table was the starting pistol for a race Amelia was determined to win. Her new life's mission, forged in the fires of exhaustion and humiliation, was the reclamation of her past. But her plan was not born of nostalgia or regret. It was a cold, pragmatic business strategy. Ethan was no longer a person in her mind. He was an asset, a blue-chip stock that she had foolishly discarded and which had since matured into a formidable fortune. Her goal was a hostile takeover of the life she felt was stolen from her. The first phase was research. In the precious hours after her shifts, she would go to the public library, the scent of grease still clinging to her uniform, and fall down the rabbit hole of the internet. She consumed every article, every interview, every press release about Phoenix architecture. She saw the magazine covers with Ethan's face on them, a face that was leaner, sharper, and colder than the one she remembered. She saw the breathtaking photos of his award-winning buildings, structures that seemed to defy gravity and convention. She read about his firm's multi-hundred-million-dollar valuation, the global contracts, the philanthropic work. The scale of his success was staggering, far beyond anything she had imagined. Each new discovery was a cocktail of bitter envy and soaring, predatory excitement. He hadn't just rebuilt, he had created an empire she was convinced should have been hers. Finding his personal location, however, proved to be a formidable challenge. The articles mentioned he was fiercely private. He was no longer listed in any public directory. Her old friends, the ones from their married life, either ignored her calls or offered polite, but firm, rejections. The bridges she had burned had turned to ash. After weeks of hitting dead ends, she knew she had to make the one call she had been dreading, the call that would be both an admission of failure and a recruitment of her most powerful ally. She called her mother. Eleanor listened to Amelia's carefully edited story, a tale of a brilliant but treacherous Julian who had deceived her, stolen from her, and left her for dead. Amelia painted herself as a victim, a woman who had been through a terrible ordeal and had finally seen the light, finally understood that the quiet stability Ethan offered was the true prize. Eleanor, a woman who worshipped at the altar of wealth and status, was not fooled by the performance, but she fully endorsed the objective. She had also seen the articles about Ethan. Her former son-in-law, the man she had deemed not ambitious enough, had become one of the most successful men in his field. He was no longer a disappointment. He was a missed opportunity, a jackpot they had let slip through their fingers. "Oh, you poor thing," Eleanor cooed, her voice a perfect symphony of false sympathy and strategic encouragement. "Of course, you must go back to him. He loved you, Amelia. A man's first true love. That's a bond that never truly breaks. He's probably just been waiting for you to come to your senses." Within 48 hours, Eleanor's private investigator had Ethan's new address. The next step was transformation. Eleanor wired her a sum of money that felt like a fortune after months of living on tips. But Amelia didn't spend it on designer clothes or a day at the spa. She used it with the precision of a costume designer preparing an actress for a career-defining role. She bought a single, elegant, dark gray cashmere dress, expensive but understated. She had her hair professionally styled, but in a way that looked soft and natural, not ostentatious. She spent hours in front of the mirror in her mother's guest room, rehearsing. She practiced the way her voice should break with emotion when she said his name. She perfected the look of world-weary sorrow in her eyes. She crafted the story she would tell, a narrative of repentance, of lessons learned, of a woman broken by the world who only wanted to come home. She was not preparing for a reunion. She was preparing for an audition. The day she chose to go was a Tuesday, late afternoon. A storm was brewing, the sky a dramatic, bruised purple, a perfect pathetic fallacy for the scene she was about to create. She took a taxi, watching the gritty landscape of Queens bleed into the manicured perfection of the wealthy Westchester suburbs. The cab turned onto a private, tree-lined road and pulled up before a set of imposing iron gates. Beyond them, at the end of a long, sweeping driveway, stood Ethan's new home. It was not a home. It was a fortress. A stunning, uncompromising piece of modern architecture, all sharp angles, dark stone, and vast panes of glass. It was beautiful, powerful, and utterly intimidating. It was nothing like the warm, inviting house he had built for them. That house had been a nest. This was a statement. For a fleeting moment, Amelia felt a flicker of doubt. The man who built this house might not be the same soft-hearted man she had left. But she quickly crushed the feeling, replacing it with a renewed sense of purpose. This magnificent structure wasn't a sign of his change, it was a sign of his pain. He had built this fortress, she told herself, because she had broken his heart. It was a monument to her absence. This grand, empty house was just waiting for its queen to return and make it a home. She paid the driver and walked the long driveway, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the first drops of cold rain beginning to fall. Her resolve hardened with every step. She was the hero of this story, the prodigal wife returning from her journey in the wilderness. He would see her, shivering and repentant on his doorstep, and the love he once had for her would come flooding back. He would sweep her into his arms, into his vast, empty fortress, and she would comfort him. She would heal the wounds she had inflicted, and in return, he would give her back the life she deserved. In her mind, the script was already written, and it ended with her victory. She saw herself standing at those vast windows, looking out at her new kingdom. She reached the massive, imposing front door. It was a single, seamless slab of dark oak. She took a deep, steadying breath, summoning every ounce of her rehearsed vulnerability. She mentally ran through her opening lines one last time. The prey had meticulously tracked the hunter back to his new lair, fully convinced that she was the one in control, that her old charms were a key that could still unlock his heart. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she reached out and pressed the bell. The sound echoed, sharp and definitive, and she waited, ready for the final act to begin. The heavy oak door swung inward without a sound, revealing Ethan. He stood in the entryway, a silhouette against the cool, minimalist light of the vast hall behind him. He looked at her, drenched and shivering on his doorstep, and his face was a placid, unreadable mask. There was no shock, no anger, no flicker of the old love she was counting on. He simply looked at her, as one might look at a stranger who had rung the wrong bell. "Hello, Amelia," he said, his voice calm and even, devoid of any emotion. "You should come in. You'll catch your death out there." He stepped aside, and she entered, her heart beginning to pound with a strange mixture of triumph and unease. His composure was not what she had expected. The interior of the house was breathtaking and cold. It was less a home than a museum, with soaring ceilings, polished concrete floors, and vast walls of glass that looked out onto the raging storm. There were no photographs, no clutter, none of the warm, personal touches that had defined their old life. This was the home of a man who kept the world at arm's length. He led her into a cavernous living area, furnished with a few severe sculptural pieces of furniture. He gestured to a low-slung leather sofa. "Please, sit." He didn't offer her a drink, a towel, or any of the common courtesies. He simply stood by the window, his back to the storm, and waited. This was her stage. Taking a shaky breath, Amelia began her performance. "Ethan, I don't even know where to begin," she started, her voice a carefully rehearsed whisper of brokenness. "I know I don't deserve to be here. I don't deserve your forgiveness. The things I did, there's no excuse." She let a single, perfect tear trace a path down her cheek. "I was a fool, a stupid, selfish fool who didn't know what she had. I thought I wanted excitement, a bigger life, but it was all a lie. A shallow, empty lie." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with practiced remorse. "He manipulated me, Ethan, Julian. He was a monster. He took everything from me. He took the money, and he took my soul. He left me with nothing. I've spent the last year... God, Ethan, it's been a nightmare. I've been working as a waitress, just trying to survive. And every single night, I would lie awake and think of you, of this life, of the good, decent man I threw away for nothing." She rose from the sofa and took a tentative step toward him, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. "I'm not asking for a second chance. I know I have no right. I had to see you. I had to tell you that I've learned my lesson, the hardest way imaginable. I had to tell you that leaving you was the single greatest mistake of my life. I am so sorry." She finished her monologue, the final, choked sorry, hanging in the vast, silent room. She had delivered every line with perfect conviction. She waited for the expected response, his anger, his pity, his confusion. She waited for him to break. Ethan remained silent for a long, unbearable moment, simply watching her. The only sound was the drumming of the rain against the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was still unnervingly calm, but it had an edge of cold, sharp steel. "Are you finished?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. Before she could respond, he turned from the window and walked to a sleek, unassuming cabinet built into the wall. He pressed a panel, and a section slid open. From it, he retrieved a slim, leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on the massive stone coffee table between them. "That was a compelling performance, Amelia," he said, his eyes meeting hers. They were not the eyes of the man she knew. They were the eyes of a stranger, analytical and utterly devoid of warmth. "Your delivery was excellent. The tears were a nice touch, but you seem to be working from an outdated script." He opened the portfolio. Inside were not architectural drawings, but neatly organized documents and photographs. He slid the first one across the table. It was a bank statement. "You said Julian manipulated you, but this is a statement from a private, offshore account in the Cayman Islands, opened in your name 3 months before you even met him. You weren't his victim. You were actively seeking a co-conspirator for your exit strategy." He slid another document over. A copy of a rental agreement. "You said he left you with nothing in Monaco. That's true. He left you with the €300,000 debt on this penthouse, a lease which he had cleverly co-signed only as a permitted occupant, leaving you as the sole leaseholder. A predictable move." Her blood ran cold. The color drained from her face. How could you know that?" "I know everything, Amelia," he stated, his voice a flat, chilling monotone. He continued, sliding photos and documents across the table, each one a nail in the coffin of her narrative. "I know about the eviction. I know about the consignment shop in Soho, where you sold your last Birkin bag for 40 cents on the dollar. I know about the diner in Queens. I know your manager's name is Sal. I even know about the penny that one of the customers left you as a tip last Tuesday, and that the profound humiliation of that single cent is what finally drove you here today." Amelia stared at him, her rehearsed facade completely shattered, replaced by a mask of raw, primal fear. This wasn't the man she had come to reclaim. This was a monster, a ghost who had been watching her from the shadows of her own miserable life. You were watching me?" she whispered, horrified. "Observation is the first step in any successful design," he replied, his voice still calm. "I needed to understand the full scope of the structural failure before beginning my own project." He closed the portfolio. "You came here today under the assumption that the man of this house was the same man who once lived in the other one. You believed that because I was once kind, I was fundamentally weak. That was your greatest and most fatal miscalculation." He stood up, the final judge delivering his verdict. "The man you are looking for, the gentle, forgiving architect who loved you beyond all reason, is dead. He died of a broken heart and a plundered bank account in a cheap, lonely apartment 5 years ago. You were the cause of death. I am merely the executor of his estate. There is no love here for you, Amelia. There is no anger. There isn't even pity. There is simply nothing. You are a stranger in my house." He walked toward the hall, his meaning clear. "The taxi you took to get here is still waiting at the gate. I paid the driver to keep the meter running for an hour. I assumed you would not be staying for long." The calculated, dismissive cruelty of that final detail broke her. The tears she shed now were real, born not of repentance, but of pure, impotent rage and the terror of absolute defeat. She had walked in here believing she was a queen returning to her throne. Now she saw the truth. She had never been the hunter. She had been the prey, and she had just walked willingly and foolishly, straight into the heart of a perfectly designed, inescapable trap. Without another word, she stumbled out of the cold, silent house, back into the raging storm, utterly and irrevocably broken. As the sound of the front door clicking shut echoed through the cavernous hall, Ethan remained motionless, a statue of stillness in the heart of his own creation. Outside, the storm, as if tied to the drama within, began to lose its fury. The torrential downpour softened to a steady, cleansing rain. He felt no elation, no savage thrill of victory. The final confrontation had not been a release of pent-up rage. It had been a clinical, necessary procedure, like the final inspection of a completed structure before declaring it sound. He had simply presented the facts, and the facts had been undeniable. The chaotic, destructive force that was Amelia had finally been contained and expelled from his world. He walked back to the great window, watching as the city lights began to pierce through the receding sheets of rain, their reflections shimmering on the wet glass. For 5 years, he had been building towards this moment. Not just building his company, his fortune, or this house, but building this version of himself, a man who could face the ghost of his own destruction and feel nothing but a profound, unshakable calm. He had turned his heart into a fortress, and the siege was finally over. His phone buzzed on the stone countertop, a single, discreet vibration. He looked at the caller ID. Arthur Davies. He answered, his voice as calm as it had been all evening. "It's done," Ethan said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Yes, it's done." The old lawyer's gravelly voice confirmed on the other end of the line. The anonymous, meticulously detailed tip regarding Mr. Vance's various offshore shell corporations was acted upon by the relevant authorities this morning. Interpol, in conjunction with the IRS's International Fraud Division, froze his primary accounts in Dubai less than an hour ago. He walked into his new bank to make a withdrawal and discovered he was a man without a country or a currency. Ethan listened, his expression unchanged. "And Miss Croft?" There was a slight pause, and Arthur Davies allowed himself a dry chuckle, the sound of a master strategist admiring a perfectly executed endgame. "Ah, yes, Miss Croft. That, my boy, is the truly elegant part of the design. As we anticipated, the initial seed money for several of Vance's fraudulent ventures was funneled directly from the accounts he and Miss Croft shared in Monaco. The very accounts she funded with the money stolen from you." Davies continued, his voice precise. "She wasn't just his lover. In the eyes of the law, she was his initial investor and a party to multiple counts of financial fraud and money laundering. Her name is on every wire transfer. The paper trail is impeccable. When she attempts to use her passport for any international travel, it will be flagged. When she tries to open a new bank account, it will be flagged. A federal summons for questioning will be delivered to her mother's residence within the week. She has been legally and financially boxed in. There is no escape route. She didn't just lose the past she tried to reclaim tonight, Ethan. She lost any chance of a future. This was the final, invisible piece of the architecture of his revenge. It was not enough for her to be rejected. It was not enough for her to be poor and humiliated. Justice, true justice, required consequence. He had not sought a petty, emotional vengeance. He had simply created the conditions for the law to run its inevitable, impartial course. He had built a wall of justice around her, and the final brick had just been laid. "Thank you, Arthur," Ethan said quietly, "for everything." "Don't thank me, son," Davies rumbled. "I just followed the blueprint. You were the architect." Ethan ended the call and looked out at the now clear night sky. The rain had stopped completely, washing the world clean. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet, profound tranquility he had not felt in years. It was not the giddy feeling of happiness, but the deep, resonant satisfaction of a complex project brought to its perfect completion. He had survived. He had taken the rubble of his old life and used it as the foundation for an empire. He had faced the person who destroyed him and had, with surgical precision, dismantled her last hope of ever hurting him or anyone else again. He had not torn her down with rage. He had simply built her, creating a structure of success and consequence so vast and solid that she could never touch its walls. And so our story of the silent architect concludes. It serves as a potent reminder that the deepest wounds often forge the strongest steel. Life, in its cruel wisdom, sometimes forces us to become the architects of our own salvation, to design a future from the wreckage of our past. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. Do not mistake their lack of complaint for a lack of strength. For in that silence, they are not grieving. They are drawing a blueprint for a justice all their own. Thank you for joining us for this story. We hope to see you again for our next journey into the complex, dramatic, and unforgettable heart of the family.